Imagine being a mother in Sparta around 600 BCE. You've just given birth. Your baby cries, and in the next moment, everything changes. A powerful man, your husband, looks down at your newborn, and with a single glance, your child's fate is sealed. If he deems the infant unfit, it will be carried to a mountainside, left to die of exposure. This wasn't just a father's choice. It was the law. The law that said, if the child is weak, the state cannot afford to keep it. But what happens when a mother's love is pitted against the cold law of survival? In Sparta, there was no room for mercy, only duty. And the price of that duty? It was the blood of the innocent. For years, Spartan mothers held their tongues, accepting the law. But deep in the shadows of Mount Taygetus, the real fight for survival began, not just for the infants, but for the mothers themselves. How much could they sacrifice before their silence became their own undoing? Nowhere was this practice harsher than in Sparta. By the 6th century BCE, the city was obsessed with strength. A weak baby was seen as a danger to the whole state. Infants were taken to a rocky place near Mount Taygetus, a spot called the Apothete. Here, tiny bodies were left to die. To Spartans, it wasn't murder. It was civic duty. They believed only the strongest deserved to live, because only the strongest could defend Sparta. Imagine the silence of those mountains, broken only by the cries of newborns left behind. But what about the mothers? In 600 BCE Sparta, a woman could give birth only to see her husband take the baby away. Her voice didn't matter. Her tears didn't matter. The father decided, the city enforced, and the law was final. Historians rarely mention their pain, but we can imagine it. Women whispered prayers to the gods, hoping for mercy. Some held their babies one last time before watching them vanish into the night. Silent grief was their only rebellion. And still, the cycle continued, because in Sparta, strength mattered more than love. In 500 BCE, religion gave the Greeks a shield for their conscience. Parents told themselves they weren't killing the child, they were offering it to the gods. If an exposed baby survived, it meant the gods had chosen to spare it. If it died, well, that too was divine will. In Sparta, this belief was tied to the city's obsession with strength. To them, the gods demanded the weak be cast aside so the strong could flourish. And so, faith itself became the silent accomplice of exposure. But not everyone stayed silent. By the 4th century BCE, great thinkers began to wrestle with the morality of exposure. Aristotle, brilliant yet cold, wrote in Politics, "No deformed child shall live." His words carried weight, reinforcing cruelty with philosophy. Yet there was also Plato, who in the Republic suggested removing weak children, but admitted the idea troubled him. For the first time, Greece's brightest minds shone a light on the cracks in their society's logic. Was strength worth more than compassion? Their debates planted the earliest seeds of doubt. By 580 BCE, Mount Taygetus had a terrible reputation. Locals called a spot there the Apothete, the place of rejection. Travelers said they heard faint cries in the night, drifting from the rocks. Some shepherds tried to save babies, but most turned away. In Sparta, leaving an infant there wasn't a crime. It was tradition. The mountain itself became a monument to the city's iron will and to its cold heart. In Sparta, law crushed love. By the 6th century BCE, even a mother's tears couldn't save her child. Newborns were brought before the elders, the Gerousia, who inspected every limb, every breath. If they judged the child weak, there was no appeal. The decision was final. And so, love bowed before law. What we call cruelty, they called responsibility. For Spartans, the survival of the state was more important than the life of one child. Helot slaves often worked near the hills where infants were abandoned. Some believed these babies were cursed, carrying bad omens. Most walked past without daring to touch them. But whispers tell of a few helots who, risking punishment, carried children home and raised them in secret. Did all those stories happen? We can't be sure. But the very fact they survived in legend shows us one truth. Even in an age of cruelty, compassion never died completely. In 550 BCE, while official records ignored mothers, Greek poetry gave them a voice. Fragments of laments speak of empty arms and broken lullabies. Though women were expected to stay silent, grief leaked through in whispers and verse. Imagine a mother who sang to her child one night, only to wake the next morning to silence. Her baby gone, taken by law, taken by duty. These cries, though hidden, were the quiet rebellion of women who never stopped feeling the cost. Sparta was harsh, but what about Athens? In the 5th century BCE, Athenians also practiced exposure, but for different reasons. Here, it wasn't about military perfection. It was about poverty. Families with too many mouths to feed left infants at crossroads or temple steps, hoping strangers would take them. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. In Athens, exposure wasn't law. It was desperation. A cruel choice forced by hunger, not by the state. By the 5th century BCE, the streets of Athens held another dark secret. Infants who survived exposure sometimes ended up in the slave market. A baby left at a crossroads might be picked up not by a savior but by a traitor. Raised without a name or family, they were sold into labor. Some grew into servants, others into gladiators. Exposure wasn't always the end. Sometimes it was just the beginning of another cruel life. Around 430 BCE, Athens buzzed with debates. The sophists and philosophers clashed over the morality of exposure. Was it necessity, or was it injustice? Aristotle and Plato leaned toward practicality, but others, like the Pythagoreans, valued life as sacred. Imagine sitting in a symposium, wine flowing, while men debated whether a baby should live or die. For Greece, this wasn't just philosophy, it was everyday reality. One tale from 5th century BCE Athens speaks of a poor craftsman who left his newborn daughter at a temple gate. Days later, guilt tore him apart. He rushed back, but she was gone. Was she rescued, enslaved, dead? No one knows. What mattered was the torment of the father who couldn't escape his choice. Exposure didn't just kill infants, it haunted those who left them behind. Theater was Greece's mirror. On stage, playwrights like Euripides slipped in themes of abandonment. Characters lamented lost children. Gods punished fathers who exposed their own blood. Audiences wept, but they also recognized themselves. The power of tragedy was this. It took the hidden grief of exposure and placed it under the torchlight, forcing Greeks to face what they often ignored. By 400 BCE, exposure was openly defended as a way to manage population. Too many children meant famine. Too many mouths meant ruin. Families argued they weren't cruel. They were practical. But beneath this reasoning lay fear. Fear of weakness, fear of poverty, fear of burden. And so the cries of infants became the price of survival. In Sparta, exposure wasn't about poverty, it was about perfection. By 450 BCE, Spartans believed every citizen must be a warrior. A weak infant wasn't just a private burden. It was a threat to the entire polis. And so, the Spartan ideal, a society of the strongest, was built on the graves of its most vulnerable. The infamous Spartan agoge, the brutal schoolboys entered at age 7, began long before childhood. It began at birth. Only infants who survived exposure entered the agoge. Every soldier in Sparta's army was a product of this system. The terror of the Spartan phalanx was born not on the battlefield, but on the mountainside. Spartan women were stronger and freer than most Greek women. They trained, owned land, and commanded respect. Yet even they were taught to accept exposure. A woman who wailed for her baby was shamed. Pride, not grief, was demanded of her. Over time, Spartan mothers learned to hide their pain, repeating the hard lesson, better one strong child than many weak. By 440 BCE, visitors to Sparta left shocked accounts. To them, infant exposure was barbaric. How could a city throw away its children? Yet some outsiders admired it. They saw Spartan warriors and linked their power to their ruthless beginnings. Sparta's cruelty was condemned and praised in equal measure, feared by neighbors, yet envied for its results. The Oracle of Delphi spoke on wars, harvests, and kings. But when it came to infant exposure, silence. Some took that silence as approval. Others believed the priests simply avoided the subject. Either way, the gods never spoke against it, and so divine silence gave human cruelty the freedom to continue. By the 4th century BCE, Athens was crumbling under the weight of war and poverty. For poor families, every new child was another mouth they could not feed. Exposure wasn't law here like in Sparta. It was desperation. Infants were left at crossroads or temple steps, tiny bundles of hope and tragedy. Some were rescued, others disappeared into the night. By 350 BCE, many abandoned children in Athens were swept into slavery. A foundling left outside a shrine could be raised not as a son or daughter, but as property. Some grew into house servants. Others labored in silver mines where life expectancy was painfully short. Survival didn't always mean freedom. For many, it only meant chains. Plato, who lived from 427 to 347 BCE, dreamed of the perfect republic. Yet even he suggested weak children should be removed for the sake of the state. He wrestled with a paradox: justice for all citizens, but not for the weakest. His writings reveal the conflict of his age, brilliance clouded by cruelty disguised as reason. Aristotle, the great philosopher of reason, lived from 384 to 322 BCE. In his book Politics, he declared, "No deformed child shall live." His words carried the force of law. By reducing life to utility, Aristotle gave exposure the stamp of philosophy. Cold logic overruled compassion, and his influence would echo for centuries. But not all philosophers agreed. The Pythagoreans, a mystical school in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, believed all life was sacred. Their voices were quiet, but powerful. They challenged Greece to see infants not as burdens, but as souls. Though ignored by most, their defiance planted seeds of future compassion. Crossroads in Athens were places of fate. By 340 BCE, abandoned infants were often left where streets met. Travelers passed by. Some reached down with mercy. Others looked away. The crossroads became a cruel test of conscience, where gods and humans watched to see if anyone would choose compassion. Greek midwives, women skilled in birth, often carried terrible duties. If a father rejected his child, it was the midwife who took the infant away. Her hands, which brought life into the world, sometimes carried it to death. Yet some resisted, secretly helping mothers hide children or arranging adoptions in secret. Quiet acts of rebellion against a tradition too strong to fight openly. Greek myths echoed the reality of exposure. Think of Oedipus, abandoned as an infant on a mountain, only to return and fulfill his cursed destiny. Audiences connected instantly because they knew exposure wasn't just myth, it was real. Literature transformed their cruelty into tragedy, mirroring the society that practiced it. Sparta's helot slaves, forced to farm and serve, often heard the cries from Mount Taygetus. Some whispered they rescued infants, raising them in hidden villages. History doesn't confirm these stories, but the legends remain. Tales of compassion born from the hearts of the oppressed, who knew too well what it meant to be discarded. During the Peloponnesian War, 431-404 BCE, The cries of exposed infants grew louder. War brought famine, and famine forced choices no parent wanted to make. Children became silent casualties of conflict, not on the battlefield, but in the shadows of temples and mountainsides. War didn't just kill soldiers, it stole newborns too. In 380 BCE Athens, a story spread of a baby abandoned at a temple gate. A childless couple took her in, raising her as their own. She grew into a skilled artisan, her origins hidden. Stories like this were rare, but they kept hope alive, that mercy could sometimes rewrite fate. Corinth, a wealthy trade city, hid darker markets. By the 4th century BCE, exposed infants who survived were sometimes sold into slavery or prostitution. The laughter of merchants masked the cries of children robbed of innocence. Exposure fed commerce, and commerce fed cruelty, turning helpless lives into commodities. By 350 BCE, debates over exposure grew louder. Some said it was practical, others condemned it as injustice. But these were not abstract debates. They were real. Men argued in symposiums while babies lay dying at crossroads. Words in marble halls, tears in silent homes. A story tells of a Spartan woman in 370 BCE who hid her unfit child. She nursed him in secret, her love stronger than fear. But when discovered, she was shamed, and the child taken. Even in Sparta, where law ruled with iron, mothers sometimes fought, and sometimes lost. By the late 4th century BCE, some parents turned to the oracle of Delphi. Should their child live or die? The priests gave riddles, never answers. In the end, families twisted the words to suit their fears. Even prophecy could not save the infants, only justify their abandonment. By 360 BCE, exposure had become routine. It no longer shocked anyone. It was spoken of casually, practiced quietly, and accepted as normal. Perhaps the most terrifying part was not the act itself, but how ordinary it became. Some poets dared to cry out. Fragments of verse mourn lost children, hinting at guilt society tried to hide. These poems, though rare, remind us that art carried grief where law silenced it. Through poetry, the abandoned lived on, if only in words. By 350 BCE, records suggest more girls than boys were abandoned. Sons were heirs, soldiers, workers. Daughters were burdens. This silent gender war reshaped Greece's population. Behind the statues and temples, countless little girls vanished before their lives had even begun. In the late 4th century BCE, Stoic philosophy emerged. Unlike others, Stoics spoke of dignity, natural law, and universal worth. They weren't mainstream yet, but they asked dangerous questions. If every soul is part of nature's order, how could any soul be discarded? Yet Aristotle's shadow remained. Even after his death in 322 BCE, his words about exposure guided rulers and lawmakers. His philosophy made cruelty sound logical. Generations after him, families still repeated his reasoning. We are not cruel, we are wise. But wisdom and mercy rarely walked together. In 4th century BCE Thebes, exposure was practiced too, though less ruthlessly than in Sparta. Some families left infants near riverbanks instead of mountainsides. The river carried their cries downstream. Some were pulled out alive, others vanished under the current. Even water became an accomplice in this silent cruelty. Legends tell of shepherds in 330 BCE who found abandoned babies and raised them as their own. Were all these stories true? Maybe not. But the fact that people told them shows something deeper. Society longed to believe compassion still lived in the shadows of cruelty. In times of famine, exposure spiked. Records from 320 BCE Athens describe whole districts where newborns vanished. Parents told themselves they were saving the family, but really, it was hunger making the choice. Famine devoured the living and the newborn. Religion still justified exposure. By the 4th century BCE, many Greeks said, If the child lives after exposure, the gods want it so. It was fatalism disguised as faith. By handing responsibility to the gods, families could bury their guilt under divine silence. By 300 BCE, cracks appeared. Exposure didn't vanish, but it began to decline. Philosophy was changing, and some communities whispered that perhaps it was too cruel. Still, tradition dies slowly. For many families, abandonment remained easier than raising another mouth. Old habits fought hard against new ideas. When Rome rose in power, they borrowed Greek customs, exposure included. By the 3rd century BCE, Roman households exposed infants as freely as Greeks once did. Cruelty traveled across borders. What began on Spartan hillsides now echoed in Roman alleyways. Greece had exported more than culture. It exported its darkest practice. By the Hellenistic age, Stoic voices grew louder. They argued that nature itself gave dignity to all people. It was a radical idea, that even the weakest infant had value. These arguments didn't end exposure yet, but they cracked the armor of tradition. In the 3rd century BCE, some Greek families started hiding exposure, ashamed before outsiders. What once was civic pride in Sparta or survival in Athens was now whispered in shadows. Exposure had not ended, but its defenders were no longer as proud. Stories like that of Oedipus, left to die as a baby, became timeless. Greeks retold these myths over and over, fascinated by fate. But beneath the entertainment was unease. They were watching their own culture reflected back at them, and not liking what they saw. By the late 3rd century BCE, adoption slowly gained ground. Families without heirs sometimes took in abandoned infants. It was still rare, but it showed a shift. For the first time, more people began to ask, instead of discarding life, why not save it? In Hellenistic Greece, 2nd century BCE, a shift began. Inscriptions appeared mentioning children saved from exposure. For the first time, rescues weren't whispered in secret. They were proudly recorded. Compassion, long buried, was finally stepping into the light. New schools of thought, from cynics to stoics, condemned exposure. They argued, how can a society claim justice while discarding its weakest? Their voices were still small, but they reached the ears of rulers and elites. The seed of doubt had grown into something harder to ignore. In the 2nd century BCE, literature gave women their voices. Plays and poems depicted mothers openly lamenting the loss of their children. On stage, what society silenced in reality was finally spoken. The grief of mothers became art, and art became protest. Historians note that by the 2nd century BCE, shrinking populations forced change. Cities needed every citizen they could raise. Ironically, the same economics that once fueled exposure, too many mouths to feed, now slowed it down. Suddenly, every child mattered. As Greece declined, Rome rose. By the 1st century BCE, Roman exposure made Greek practices look merciful in comparison. Infants were abandoned openly on streets, picked up by slave traders. Greece had once led in cruelty. Now, Rome carried the torch even darker. Greek philosophy spread into Rome, and with it came Stoicism, teaching that all souls share in nature's law. These ideas influenced not just elites, but later Christian thinkers. The same Greece that birthed exposure was now birthing the arguments to destroy it. As exposure declined, it lived on in myth. Stories of abandoned children, raised by fate to greatness, filled Greek theater and legend. These tales entertained, but they also revealed unease. The Greeks were trying to turn their guilt into story, their cruelty into cautionary myth. By the 1st century CE, Christianity began spreading through the Mediterranean. Unlike Greek and Roman law, Christians rejected exposure outright. They built orphanages, cared for abandoned babies, and called every life sacred. Slowly, this faith eroded centuries of acceptance, turning shame into compassion. By the 3rd century CE, the cries of abandoned infants had nearly vanished from Greece. Adoption and charity replaced exposure. What had once been civic duty or survival became a shameful memory. The hillsides, the crossroads, the temple gates, all fell silent at last. From 700 BCE to 300 BCE, infant exposure shaped Greek society. It was law in Sparta, desperation in Athens, philosophy in Aristotle's writings, and tragedy in their myths. The Greeks gave us democracy, philosophy, and art. But they also remind us of this chilling truth. Even the greatest civilizations can normalize horror. Strength built on the suffering of the weakest is no strength at all. That is the legacy of infant exposure in ancient Greece. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like this video, comment, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe so you never miss upcoming stories that shaped and scarred our world.